Yay! What's up, everybody? Thank you so much for joining for another live stream on the VS Code channel. So glad that you're here with us. We have like an exciting show, but as you know, today is Thursday, so it is time for our Throwback TikTok Thursday segment. So let's.
Do you need help focusing on your code? Then try out Zen Mode, which puts the editor in full screen and hides all other UI elements. Now it's just you and your code.
Nice. All right. So I don't want to waste any time, but I do want to say a quick hello to the first comers that are here. Code Nerd, thanks so much for being one of the first ones on the stream. And thanks again, Galaximus, for joining. Glad that you're here. It's going to be an exciting show. So I want to go ahead and bring up our first guest, Craig Peters, and I will let him give you an intro. Craig, I said Greg, sorry, I meant to say Craig.
I'm used to it, don't worry.
Craig, could you go ahead and tell us about what you do and what we're going to be chatting about today?
Absolutely. Hey, Reynald, it's so great to meet you. I'm also a first timer, so glad to be here. I've watched a couple asynchronously, but I haven't participated live. I'm a product manager. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I said welcome.
Thank you. I'm a product manager at GitHub. So what does that mean? That means that I listen to what users need. I talk to our customers. I work to understand the technology and the way developers work. And we try to work really closely with our engineers to turn that into products that hopefully you'll love.
Nice, nice.
And I work on a particular product called GitHub Codespaces, which is a cloud-based development environment.
I've heard about it. Good stuff. So, well, let me ask you this then. For today, what are we going to be chatting about?
Absolutely. So the thing that, well, it all kind of came up because one of the things I work on in Codespaces is I work very closely with folks in the dev container community. And the dev container community is an open source spec. We'll get into it more later, but basically it's a way you configure development environments. And I work really closely with the VS Code team on those development environment configurations, which is why I'm here on a VS Code live stream. And I've been working on and off with folks in the cloud native community for 7 years. And during the last year and a half, we've been talking about how it can aid the contributors and maintainers in open source projects in the cloud native community. And then in November, just about a month ago, the cloud native community was at KubeCon, Cloud Native Con in Chicago. And I had the opportunity to connect with a bunch of people about dev containers in the cloud native community. And I wanted to share sort of what those conversations were like, what's been going on. Okay. And for anybody who doesn't know, I am happy to give some sort of background on what all that means.
Nice. And what was the name of the conference?
It's called KubeCon.
KubeCon.
So,
okay.
KUBECON.
Okay. All right. Cool. And how long has that been going on? Is that like fairly new or been around for a few years now?
So it's been going on for about 7 years. It's now got 3 main instances it occurs. There's a North American instance every year, a European instance, and then almost every year there's one in China as well. And then there are sort of spin-offs of it called Cloud Native Days that
nice.
happen all around the world.
And you were speaking at it, or you?
I actually did have a speaking spot at what is called a Day Zero event. So leading up to KubeCon, a whole bunch of open source communities and companies try to get together to have like mini sub conferences that are associated with the main conference. And so I was at a thing called the Kubernetes Contributor Summit, which is a gathering where a whole bunch of contributors to Kubernetes, which is probably the second largest open source project on GitHub.
Got it.
Meet and talk about contribution.
Okay. So what we're going to be talking about today will be related to a talk that you gave at the conference, or completely different?
I'm not going to do the talk that I gave at the conference. That's on YouTube, so you can find that
Okay.
separately. Um, in fact, maybe I should add it to the resource, like the gist that we'll share in a little bit here. But the idea here is to kind of give a little background for folks who are in the VS Code community to know a little bit more about dev containers and the role that they do and potentially can play more and more in this set of open source projects that make up the cloud native community.
Cool. All right, let's get started then. And maybe we could just start off with someone that's just heard of dev containers for the first time, which I'm pretty sure everyone might have heard about it. But yeah, why don't we go ahead and just define what that is and then take it from there.
Sure. And since this is my first time, feel free to ask questions. And like, I'm not going to spend the energy looking at the comments, but please, if people have questions, bring them to me anytime.
Yeah, I'll be interacting with the comments. So you hear that, commenters, audience out there, feel free to jump in anytime to ask some questions, okay?
Absolutely. And if we could share the link to this gist that I threw together this morning, just to prepare for this, that'd be awesome. So I know that's probably should have created a short link for it, or a QR code or something. That would have made things a lot easier. I apologize for
Yeah,
not
producer,
doing
maybe if you could drop that in the chat, then people could copy and paste that.
that would make a ton of sense. So what I did was I kind of threw together some notes that we can go through, and we don't have to go through every line item, that's for sure. This is meant to be something that folks can use afterwards if it's useful. And I probably will maintain this over time, especially if people reach out. Like one thing that's probably useful is if you go to my GitHub profile, you'll find a way to reach out to me. I list all my contact info and everything there. It's really easy to find me on the internet. So your question was, what if there's somebody here who doesn't know about dev containers? Well, the first thing I have here is a link to the specifications. So it's an open source spec. What that means is that anybody can come and see what the specification is. So this is the specification itself. It defines all of the things that go into a representation of an environment that builds on top of containers and extends that to, so you'll see things like container specific things like, should it allow privilege mode, for example? Are there security options that you want to pass to the Docker engine that's actually running it? All those kind of detailed things that you can do, but I'll show you, you don't have to do. The most important thing to know here is that it supports this sort of needs of the developer in the inner loop. So as I'm a software engineer, I need my source code, I need my productivity tools, what kind of command line tools, what UI tools do I need, what debuggers and utilities do I need, what compilers and other adjacent tools does my development environment contain, and then
Okay,
what's
quick
all the
question.
runtimes. Yeah.
Quick question and a request. First, the request, can you control plus a few times so we could
Yeah,
see it better?
absolutely.
Yeah, maybe even one more time. Yeah, perfect. And if someone first started reading about dev containers and they immediately started thinking in terms of like a clone, like how is it different than just like a copy of an environment? What's different?
That's a great question. An environment is your thing. Like, so for example, we usually think about our development environments as what we have on our laptops or our desktop, whatever the computer is that we have our hands on. We maintain the operating system, we install our IDE there, we install all these things in our personal environment.
Mm-hmm.
What a dev container does is it allows us to have one single common shared definition of what needs to be in that environment, so that somebody who's new can come in and without any work, without reading pages and pages of readmes, without having to understand how that version of Python is consistent or inconsistent with the version of Python that I'm already using for some other project,
Mm-hmm.
and debug all of those things. The definition of the dev container contains all that encapsulated in containers so that it can be separate and not interfere with anything else I have going on my local machine, and thus makes it easier for me to get started. And it makes it easier for me to work on multiple projects at the same time without maintaining those conflicts. And it also allows me to not worry as somebody who's working a project. Either I'm a person who knows deeply about the project and all of its needs and the things that change, and then part of my job is to maintain this environment definition, or I'm not a part of that. My job is just to write the code, and I don't have to worry about that at all. I can just get updates and changes as the project evolves and changes over time. So what that does is that gets me out of it gets both kind of parties, the people who are responsible for maintaining the environment and the people who just get to use that environment. It gets you out of that shared pain of having to keep up to date with changes in dependency versions, incompatibilities between libraries, all of the sort of day-to-day fiddling just to get stuff to work
So is
disappears.
it almost like having a virtual machine that's customizable?
That's one way to do it. And in fact, that's how GitHub does it for GitHub Codespaces. But there are lots of ways to use dev containers. So there are other people who use dev containers by spinning up individual containers for each thing on their local machines. And then there are like other open source projects that will run a dev container in a Kubernetes cluster. So it'll run a pod with a dev container that you can connect to, so you can kind of scale up and out all of those things.
Okay.
But the fundamental thing is that it's packaged declarative way to treat the environment. And because it's declarative, we all can look at the same definition. We can all create pull requests against that same definition and collaborate to make sure that we've got the best possible environment for everybody to be working on a given set of code.
Got it. All right. Cool.
I love that question. That was great. I tend to sort of jump over this stuff too quickly, and I'm glad we took the time. Are there other questions about the dev container specification itself?
No other questions right now in the comments, so we can
Okay,
continue.
cool. So I kind of teased some of the things here. The things that you see in the dev container definition are what packages there are, what processes need to be running when you start an environment. Like maybe every time I run an environment, I need to start Node, for example, depending on what I'm working on, or I need to start a Kubernetes cluster. And so you can automate that using lifecycle automation. And it sets up all the IDE configurations. So say, for example, you know that everybody who's working on our project should have a particular setting in their VS Code or a particular set of extensions to make contribution really straightforward. It allows that container to be connected to remotely. So you're running that container wherever that container is running. I can use VS Code and the dev containers extension in VS Code to connect to that.
Okay.
Other people have implemented it other ways. And then it also handles like if a process is running and it exposes a port, so I'm running at like a node server, that port automatically gets forwarded so that I can connect that web server from my web browser, or I can share that port if my IP server, if my machine that's running that has the ability to share that IP address with somebody, they can connect to it. So like Codespaces, for example, we automate all of that so that you can share the ports for your running server with anybody on the internet, or it could be secured. Only you can use it, or only people inside your GitHub organization can use it.
Okay.
That the whole idea there is collaboration on a common definition of an environment.
All right, cool. So what is next then?
Well, what that unlocks is a bunch of different kinds of use cases that are really important. I kind of thought about it in the cloud native sense because it's really focused on open source, but all of these things are also true in your work. Like anytime you're doing coding, whether it's in education, professionally, as side projects, however you're doing things, all of these things are kind of unlocked. One is I can explore and learn without having to do all the heavy lifting of reading through tons of readmes and having to understand things. That allows anybody to come and try anything quite easily. The other really cool use case I hear a lot is that one of the problems when I love workshops. I don't know, Reynald, do you attend workshops regularly?
I like to, not so much in person. I usually just like to watch a lot of videos, workshops, and courses online. So
It makes sense. And
yeah,
do you follow through and do it on your own machine as you're doing it, as you're
yeah,
watching? Yeah,
yeah. I don't get. I don't remember much if I'm just like watching it, unless I'm just like watching it just to get like answers for a particular problem. Then yeah, I might not like go through and redo everything myself. But if I'm trying to learn something, I feel like there's like three different levels of like learning. One is just like uh watching something passively. Then the second level is where you're actually interacting and like, doing it hands on. And then the third level is to actually teach it to someone else, because then you're really forced to understand it. So I try to at least get the two levels.
that makes a ton of sense. And one of the most rewarding things is when you actually get to do it and you get that experience of it actually working, and then you can start exploring the boundaries of what's been put together in the workshop. You try things that aren't in the workshop, right? Because you have all the things set up, right?
Hmm.
One of the least good experiences is you show up with your Mac and the workshop is all set up for Windows, or you show up
Oh,
for
okay.
Windows and it's all set up for a Linux environment,
Right.
and you don't have WSL configured or something, right? And so one of the really killer use case for dev containers is workshops. So you're trying to participate or give a workshop. If you have a dev container set up, everybody can come, and as long as you have Docker installed or you have access to GitHub Codespaces, which everyone does, uh, you can either spin up your environment locally or in the cloud, and it just works. And that's an amazing thing. You get rid of that. Thanks for putting the link up there, but you get rid of that.
That hurdle.
Usually it's like 45 minutes at the beginning of every workshop where everybody's trying to help each other get to the first step in the workshop, and that goes away, and everybody gets to that sort of joy much faster.
So then with the dev container, can you be on a Windows machine and you spin up a container that's assumes that it's like a Mac environment?
So yeah, most containers are Linux. So you can spin up a Windows container or a Linux container. So happily, the Docker desktop for Windows supports Linux containers. So the dev container definition today only works with Linux containers.
Okay.
And so you can run those Linux containers on your Windows host or on your Mac host or your Linux box.
Got it.
And So what Codespaces then does, which that link came up, is it spins up a VM running Linux in the cloud for you and spins up the dev container automatically for you. And we can look at that in a demo in a minute.
All right, cool.
So workshops are killer. The next set of use cases, I mean, this is not a complete list of use cases at all, but these are just sort of the highlights that come to mind really quickly. One of the things I love about dev containers is it helps people who want to get involved but aren't yet or even don't want to be coders, right? Like open source, I believe I have this like strong passion that open source ways of working can change the world because they're all about collaboration and listening to the points of view of people from different backgrounds, different world views, different life experiences who understand problems in different ways than each other. And open source provides a forum in which all of those views can come together to a common purpose. And in order to have actual solutions to common purpose, it takes a lot more than just having code that works. Right? Code that works is just a tiny piece of it. And one of the big challenges we have in open source tech is that there's this like hierarchy of like code is king and everything else is sort of like, well, thank you very much, that's nice. We're all trying very hard to change that, but it's really it's a cultural thing to kind of change. And one of the things dev containers can do is it can make all the other things that often have a dependency on some of the same environments. So if you go to an open source project, oftentimes even contributing to the documentation requires you to set up the same exact kind of environment that you would use to make a change to the code. And if you're not a coder and you have like things you want to do in that open source community, oftentimes it's writing stuff. And language is a very powerful tool. And that's a barrier to all of these people who have different contributions to make. And so the dev container can eliminate that barrier. It can make it so that anybody who has access to the internet can go and make contributions to any project. And so that's one of my very favorite things about this.
Okay.
And then for the maintainers, it's really important too, because it makes it easier to have new contributors. And it also makes it safe to do reviews of pull requests. So if you think about what a pull request is, it's code that you didn't write, that somebody else is trying to put into a project that if you're a maintainer, you have a lot of commitment to, a lot of emotional attachment to. And you don't know people on the internet, on the internet, everybody's a dog, right? Like it's, you don't want to necessarily trust every bit of code. And so at first, right, you got to look at it, you got to understand it. And so what a dev container could do is you can start up a dev container that protects the rest of your environment. It's isolated and run that code to protect its impact on anything else you're doing.
Exactly. By the way, I want to ask people in the chat, if you guys are currently using dev containers or thinking about it, could you mention it in the chat? And let me know any hurdles that you've come across while using it.
That would be awesome. I'd love to hear about those. Part of the idea of them is that if you look at we'll look at a few, I'll try to get through the rest of this pretty quickly because I think we'll get into really interesting stuff when we start looking at some actual dev container configurations and what they do.
Totally agree. Oh, and a question just came up here by Alroth. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. Alroth. Producer, if you could bring that up. With AI model training becoming a large part of the industry now and coding around those models, does dev container support for pass through a specific hardware like GPU access?
Absolutely. So that depends on the driver for the GPU being exposed to the Docker service that's hosting the dev container. So as long as your GPU is visible to the Docker host, the Docker service, or the Docker daemon, then you can have access to the GPU. That's a really critical use case for a lot of future workloads.
Cool. All right. So, as you were saying, before I threw up that question.
Sure. So let's kind of delve a little bit into the cloud native ecosystem. I don't want to dwell on this too much, but I have some nice links in the gist here to well, what is the cloud native ecosystem? For me, it's open source tools that anybody can use, designed to build resilient applications optimized for the cloud, right? So this is just sort of elastic and available over the network compute. And it's a ton of open source tools, right? So the whole ecosystem consists of just an enormous number of open source projects. Like, we're not going to navigate this, but this is the CNCF's cloud native landscape. So this is the ecosystem of open source projects that conference I went to is about, right? And so at that conference, you get companies who are using these and are trying to learn how to navigate that ecosystem better, how to manage the engineering processes required to consume that much open source that's constantly changing in their organization. If you imagine a lot of older style IT organizations struggle to deal with the constant change of open source and navigating sort of the many different choices. So actually, if we go back to that real quickly, like they're categorized here. So you'll see under databases, there are a lot of databases in this ecosystem, right? There's a lot of streaming and messaging services. They're all different, but they all have some common sets of use cases, right? And so figuring out what to use when is really important. And they go to this conference to learn from each other. And then the maintainers go to also try to recruit new contributors and make sure companies know that just because open source, you can download it, doesn't mean it's free, right? Like that you have, in order to get the most out of open source, you have to contribute. You have to be a part of the ecosystem. You have to understand all the security implications and understand maintenance and make sure that you're taking a dependency on something that as an organization you can trust.
Yeah, you gotta be really involved. Couple of comments, questions too. By Antoine G. I use it, but it's a bit difficult to shift from Dockerfile / Docker-compose mindset, but it's doable. Any comment?
Yeah, I'd love, Antoine, for you to reach out and let's talk about that some more. The mindset of the Dockerfile and Docker Compose is fundamentally that you're creating a package that has all of the tools contained in it that define what you need to run in your container. Dev containers are intended to extend those. And in fact, you can, if we go just quickly jump back to the dev container specification, one of the things you'll find in here is the guide. And in here is a guide on using Docker files and Docker Compose. So the dev container specification will allow you to, so here's your Docker Compose, right? It's next to your dev container JSON, and then you just reference your compose within the dev container specification. So you can reuse your existing Docker file or your existing compose configuration with the dev container specification. The dev container spec just layers on top of it things that are specific to the you can then add your VS Code extensions and what you need to do after the environment's up and running to make sure everything's available to the user, like start your database, for example, and expose its port so that the client service can connect to it. And this guide in the dev container specification can help you with that.
Cool. Another comment by Wipeout wipeouts is. Sometimes I wish it was like a little description of like what's the inspiration and history behind like
Yeah, we need handle etymology.
yeah, wipeouts. You know what? Wipeouts. You should like add a comment mentioning like where did your name come from? That just sounds interesting. But here she says, I use dev containers. They are great. Any suggestions, recommendations for handling keys and secrets? I use .env files that have to be edited manually on every new dev environment.
Yeah, so that's an area of innovation in dev containers right now. So we recently added to the dev container spec suggested secrets, and each implementer of the dev container spec has options for how they satisfy the secrets, basically automating the process of populating your environment files to have those secrets so that you don't have to manually update them. The one I know best is the GitHub implementation, which uses GitHub managed secrets, which means you have user secrets, you've got repository secrets, you have organization level secrets, and we're even working on enterprise level secrets so that you can manage those across your enterprises. And what that does is when you create a code space that uses the dev container, it will automatically inject into that environment the secrets from the scope that is relevant at that point in time. And so you can leverage secrets that you manage independently of the dev container specification in that by using code spaces to run your dev containers. But every provider has different approaches to that. So Code Sandbox also has implemented dev containers. They have their own approach to managing and automating the updates of secrets. Great question.
Cool. All right. So next comment by Ed Schneider. He says, you've mentioned Docker files several times. Is there a dependency on Docker?
There is a dependency on Docker. So dev container is an extension of the Docker definition and depends on the Docker daemon running. So what a dev container is so there's a CLI. So let's go back to the dev container spec. And one of the really important tools is the dev container CLI. The dev container CLI, yep, here's the repo. You can get the packages here. And basically it's a node application. So installing it is just as simple as npm install dev container CLI. It does depend on Docker being installed wherever you are. It also supports Podman. So you essentially whatever way in which you can have the services that reference that can run the container in that environment, you can use the dev container CLI to run dev container up, and then it'll use whatever dev container configuration is in that environment to then create the container and connect you as a user to that container. There's a whole bunch of optional arguments that allow you to do things like run a shell, for example, or run a specific command inside the dev container. But all of that underlying is essentially orchestration around then making exactly the right call to the Docker daemon to run the container with all of the essentially syntactic sugar that the dev container definition is. There are a bunch of great examples in this repo that you can find from the dev container spec.
Cool. All right. And we continue.
Awesome. So now that we know a little bit about the cloud native ecosystem, and we know that actually one of the things I want to say sort of as a preface to this is one of the things that when you go to KubeCon and you start talking to a bunch of the maintainers, there's two sides to the equation. One is that huge companies are depending on not just Kubernetes, but a ton of the rest of this open source. So Kubernetes is like a core project that has lots of maintainers and a lot of resources put on it. But there are, in fact, in one of my prior jobs, I was responsible for maintaining a set of dependencies that Microsoft had taken on Kubernetes and 60 plus different open source projects related to Kubernetes for various different pieces of Microsoft infrastructure and product that use Kubernetes. And so like Microsoft's a great example of a big company that takes these dependencies, but also takes it very seriously by investing significant engineering resources into giving back and supporting the community. So there are whole teams of people there, wonderful people I know, who contribute to these open source projects, are big parts of making sure that they keep running, that the documentation is great, that there's good developer support in them, and that people inside Microsoft are not treating it as lightly, right? That it's an important resource. However, there are lots of companies that take a lot from the open source community without giving back. And then there are the maintainers. So these are people who, some of them are employees of large companies. Some of them are independent contractors and do their own thing on the side to try to make some money. Some of them, but all of them are dedicated to making sure that their projects that they're involved in are trustworthy, are secure, are welcoming, and are extremely functional. They're amazing tools. But there's this big tension because there's a lot depending on it, and there's not as much investment in them as the value that they generate. And so people are getting burned out and frustrated. And so what I'll kind of jump ahead to is that the problem is big, right? The technology is complex. It's really hard to get started with it. There are too few maintainers of these projects, and what that does is that creates lots of friction for new contributors. Bug reproduction is hard. If you go look at the issues list in a lot of these projects, it's fraught with like, I can't reproduce that bug in my environment. That's not a proper bug reproduction, and there's a lot of sort of miscommunication. And a lot of it comes down to, it's really hard to reproduce the environment, and so the correctness of new contributions isn't necessarily good, and the correctness of bug reproduction is bad. And so my goal, my hope, is that by having the shared declarative definition of what is an environment, we can take that friction way down and make the time that people spend maintaining their local environments and just getting things right like nearly zero, so that we're focused on the actual problem, which is the code itself. And
so a couple of things though. Wipeouties did give the background to the name. Being thrown off the board by a wave, that makes sense. We all get wiped out every once in a while. I like that. No, okay. I might have to start asking more people like their names background. That's interesting. I have more appreciation for that.
I like it. Wipeout dies is like the process of doing that to something else, I guess.
Yeah, I guess. So is there like a demo? Because we have about like 20 minutes left, and I do want to have like a little time for our last segments. There's a demo of Dev Containers that you want to show us?
Absolutely. So in here, I listed a bunch of Dev Containers that I know a little bit about, and some that I just discovered this morning, kind of preparing for this in this gist. So let's take a look at a Dev Container. This is a pretty simple one, but it's a good example of how straightforward a Dev Container can be. So for those of you who come from the Dockerfile world, it feels a little uncomfortable, because one of the things you will not see in this particular dev container definition is the Docker file. I'm going to pull up a different one that I just came across that I think does have a Docker file, so we can look at that. Nope, that one doesn't. I can't remember. Sorry for this. There's Envoy proxy. Yes, this one does. So we'll look at that one as well to see the differences. But I don't know that one very well at all. This one is very simple and straightforward. So the dev container, actually, while we're looking at it, I'm going to do something else. I'm going to go start a code space, and then we'll take a look at it. So I'm just going to click this nice green button. So what I did is I just went to the main code page here.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to click this nice green button. Or the other thing I can do actually is, I know that in this one, they happen to have a contributing guide, which all good open source projects should have. And they actually describe here sort of what you need to do to set up your environment. Their README isn't too complex, but the other option is the easy button. Just open it in a GitHub code space. So
Can you control plus a couple of times?
Oh, sure. Let's go back. Does that help?
That's better. Yeah, thanks.
Sure. So this is the contributing guide for etcd. Etcd is a core component of a Kubernetes cluster. It essentially maintains, it's the state management engine for the state of all of the objects in a Kubernetes cluster, all the way from sort of the nodes down to ingress controllers, which control network connectivity in and out. All the pods, all of that data is managed in etcd, which is a highly resilient distributed key value store. And so this is a great project to talk about, because it was an example of one where very few maintainers, like a year and a half ago, very few maintainers were even paying attention to it. And people struggled because they didn't know how to get it all set up and contribute to it. They invested in adding a dev container and then adding this button to open a GitHub Codespaces to their repository. And now when they have new contributors come, they can just click this button, pulls up a screen to say, well, where do I want it? It detects where I am. I'm in the western part of the US. If I had more than one dev container, it would allow me to choose which configuration, which environment definition I want to use. And I can choose which branch I want to work on. I'm just going to choose the main because I don't really know what's going on with this environment. And then I can choose how big a machine I want. The default depends on the kind of project, but in this case, I'm just going to choose the default 2. So I'm going to let it create a code space. It takes a minute to create that dev container itself. So it's actually what Codespaces is doing is reading this file and using this as instructions for how to configure the environment that it's running.
So we're creating a dev container right now through Codespaces.
Correct. That's exactly what Codespaces is doing. It's reading this definition and saying, I need to go get this container image, which is a container image that the dev container maintainers keep. It's in the dev container namespace called Go with a specific version. It's Go 1.21. And so this already tells you something about the dependencies that etcd has. It's depending on that, and in this case, it's Bookworm, which is a specific Ubuntu distribution version, right? And then there's some instructions here. Go ahead.
Okay. Meanwhile, a couple of comments came up. Victor Mora says, I was able to liberate the project. I think she meant to say I was able to leverage the project Docker file and generate a dev container instantly. One thing I had to do was to mount the .aws folder in the dev container and was up and running in no time. Following that, she says, very pleasant not having to deal with Python virtual environments or anything. I can appreciate that.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear Victor had good success with that. That's exactly the goal, is that, Python virtual environments were made and are staying maintained to solve a very specific problem with Python versioning and Python package management and kind of isolating those things. The nice thing about containers is your virtual environment is redundant at that point, right? Like once you're in a container, it is isolated.
Yeah. Another comment, Alrath says, so the dev container definition with no Docker files means that the definition use an image as is, for example, .NET SDK, a Redis image with default ports, and the dev container exposes those default ports as is?
That's right. That's exactly right. So this is another example that's similar to what Alrath is talking about. So the Go one is a much simpler one than, say, the .NET SDK base image. So the .NET team actually maintains a set of base images for themselves, and those have built into that base image a bunch of things. We can look at that in a minute in the etcd one, which we've already started the code space. But I just want to touch on a few other things here. In this case, there are ports that the etcd wants exposed automatically that must be forwarded by whatever happens in make build. Now, I don't know etcd very well, and I don't know what make build, the outputs of make build are. I'm not 100% sure why these ports are forwarded. That's something maybe we can explore. Oh, I just discovered a new feature. I just accidentally hid the navigator. I don't know how to hide that again. So let's go take a look at what the environment looks like. So the dev container has been created. The environment is now up and running. I can see that make build is now running. It's completing that before I actually have access to the terminal. So it's not actually ready for me just yet. That's why we started looking at this, right? So if we go look at make build, I'm wondering what make build does. But the nice thing is I don't actually have to know about it, right? Like it's just going to work, and because somebody keeps that maintained. Oh, the other really kind of cool thing about having a dev container maintained as a declarative definition here is I can look at the history, and this allows me to understand: is somebody maintaining it? Are they paying attention? Who in the community are the ones who care about that shared experience, right? And this kind of helps me as a community member to know who the helpers are, right? And that's a useful thing for understanding also how the project has changed over time.
Cool.
While etcd's, the environment's up and running now. So
can you control plus?
I sure can. So it pulled up the README, but for some reason it didn't render properly. But the key thing here is I get all my source code, right? So we have that dev container that I was just looking at. That's no big deal. I've got the README and everything else here. But I can also go and look at the tests. I could run the tests. I can see all the end-to-end tests. So it's a typical Go project. The thing you'll notice is I didn't have to worry about installing the Go extensions. I'll also notice that those ports are exposed. But the interesting thing I'm also noticing here in this one, I may have feedback for the etcd team and their maintenance, but these ports are forwarded, but there's no service. There's no process listening on those ports. So in order to actually use those ports, I probably need to do something. I need to run something. And it looks like etcd is not by default in the path. It didn't make build, but I don't know where the output of that is personally, right?
And
So
what's
I guess
etcd?
etcd is this service that is a distributed key value store for storing the state of any kind of distributed system.
Okay.
So Kubernetes uses it as a core component for what's happening in a Kubernetes cluster, what objects exists, what pods exist, what ingress controllers exist, and so forth. But like if I were a new contributor and I made a change to the source, I could come in right away and run like the commands that the README tells me to run. And I didn't have to do any setup. Everything just works. I'm not going to
So
bother
the
running.
beauty of this is that we have like all the code here, but now we didn't have to like do a lot of excess configuration that we would have if it was not a dev container to make sure that it works properly in our environment. Is that correct?
That's exactly right. So like if I had gone to the contributing docs, right, the set up my environment, I would have need to follow these steps. Set up locally. They don't even give you instructions. Oh, here they are. Sorry. So you need to clone the repo. You need to install Go. You need to install all the build tools. You need to install Make, Protoc. This one's relatively simple, right? The thing is, this is manual and prone to error.
Okay.
etcd is relatively simple. Go is relatively simple to install, but you have to understand how to set up a Go environment and all the environment variables.
Okay.
Make is relatively simple, but each one of those steps is something that many people don't know, right? Because I've been working with these computers for a long time, I happen to know these particular tools. But anytime you have a new tool to somebody, that's a barrier between you and actually making the change you want to make and trying it out.
Right. And that's like a pain. Well, very nice. So we're about at that time to have our next segment, the lightning round. Are you ready for that?
Absolutely. I'm glad we got a chance to take a look at a couple of environments.
Yeah, it's been awesome. Okay, so go ahead, producer. Let's have that intro. All right, lightning round. Very simple rule. I'm just going to ask you, just going to state a question or a prompt, and you just answer first thing that comes to the top of your head. Okay.
Sounds
5.
good.
And the first is, what's your biggest pet peeve?
Oh, my biggest pet peeve is very annoying. It's when people drive their cars in the bike lane.
Ooh.
I'm a cyclist, so there's a reason there's a separate lane.
Yeah, I know. I'm sorry about that. I've been a bad person with that one. It's usually when I'm about to make a turn though, and I get in there too early,
Turns are a different thing, right? Like everybody knows about the challenges of turning in roads, so but it's a shared space at that point.
I hear you. The scariest thing you've ever done for fun?
Oh, yeah, I would say that was actually not expecting to be scary, but I was boogie boarding in Hawaii. This is a very privileged thing. I got to go to Poipu on the south end of Maui. And at the time I was living on Oahu, so I was used to surfing and boogie boarding and all that, but I was in a new place, and my son and I watched the break at Poipu. If anybody's been there, the harbor. It's like there's 2 points, and the break is beautiful. Waves come through there, and it looked perfectly safe. And so my son and I, after 45 minutes of watching, we paddled out there, and there was a set that came through that was huge, and we both got really tumbled, and that was pretty scary.
Yikes. Well, glad you made it through. And you say a set, that's like another term for wave, a big wave?
Yeah, we got another surfing term. So we got the wipeout. We wiped out. And so a set is so naturally when waves form on the ocean, they get formed because wind is constantly blowing over the ocean surface, and they're formed because of the friction between the water and the air, and it basically pushes on the water and makes the waves. It makes these little lumps of water, and because the air kind of moves up and down, it gets compressed and decompressed. The waves in the air interact with the waves in the ocean. And so what happens is the waves in the air are sort of longer, and so you'll get these sets. You'll have 5 or 6 waves that are really big, and then a bunch of smaller waves. And then you get
Oh,
5 or 6 waves that are really big. So if you watch surfers, they'll often, that first bigger wave, they'll skip it because they know that 2 or 3 waves later is going to be another even bigger wave. And
nice.
that's called a set.
Got it. All right. Now I know. Is it GIF or is it GIF?
Depends on the time of day and what I heard last. Is it gist or is it gist? You know, I'll say I say GIF.
GIF. Okay. Yeah. All right. 2 more questions. What's one VS Code extension that you cannot live without?
Ah, you wouldn't know it from the demo I did, but it's the GitHub Copilot extension because it just saves me tons of time.
I concur. That's a hard one to like if you get used to it to just go without, you go through withdrawal symptoms. First guest if you had your own talk show.
Oh, my daughter.
All right. That's good.
Yeah,
Some
she's
people
50.
get all political with that when they're like afraid to say it. They don't want to mention someone's because they feel like they're leaving out someone else. I'm just like, just say it. But I guess that's a safe one right there.
Oh, it's
Daughter.
super easy. She and I have been talking about starting a podcast for a year, and I'm sure we're going to make it happen relatively soon.
Oh, so okay, so that totally makes sense. All right, Craig, this has been wonderful. Thanks so much for coming on. If you want to share some of your info, like how can your new fans find you?
The easiest way is go to my GitHub profile. It's just github.com/Craig L. Peters. And that has my contact info. Reach out.
Awesome.
Look forward to hearing from people.
Great. Producer, if you could throw his handles up. In addition to our social media, folks, as you can see right now, we're on YouTube. That's at Code, but also we have a lot of fun TikTok that you can check out. So that is at VS Code on the TikTok channel. All right. And here it is coming. There was like a little time delay, but github.com/Craig L. Peters. And then then there's our stuff that'll be showing up next. Again, thanks. This has been awesome. And I will see you folks next time.
It was a pleasure.
Likewise.